From the center of the universe and the home of your Grey Cup champion Toronto Argonauts, it's the X's and Argos podcast.
Welcome to the X's and Argos podcast as we kick off the 2023 podcast season. Ben Grant, joined as always by JB. We've got weekly shows coming your way all the way through the Grey Cup in November, and we're going to double it up once the CFL season gets underway. So be sure to subscribe on your podcast app, or if you're watching on YouTube, so you don't miss a single episode. We got a lot going on today. We're going to talk a little bit about McLeod Bethel Thompson because people still want to talk about McLeod Bethel Thompson. It's a thing. I get so many responses when we post McLeod stuff on Twitter. So we'll just get into that briefly. But mostly, this is our draft special, and we're going to talk about the CFL Draft. It's less than a week away now as you listen to this. And before we get into any of that, I really want to share my excitement about our new title sponsor this season, Something in the Water Brewing. JB, you and I are both passionate about beer and the Toronto Argonauts, and Something in the Water combines these interests. So first of all, they're in Liberty Village. They're steps from Lamport Stadium where the Argos practice and a stone's throw from BMO Field. So I know, JB, you and I are definitely going to spend a lot of time there. And secondly, they brew great beer, which is always good in my book. They've won multiple awards. And most notably, last year, they were honored as the new brewery for the year for all of Canada, which is something special. So that's something I'm really excited about, having them on board. They create what they call curious beers like Longboat Pale Ale, which it's such a good story behind it. It was born out of a chance visit by Darius Bladek last summer to Something in the Water. And I'll tell you more about that story as we get into the season a little bit more, maybe when a Longboat is re-released later on this year. But we are thrilled to have Something in the Water on board with us, JB. Now, JB, why don't we, just before we get into the heart of our podcast here, I know we've got a lot of new listeners on board for this season. Do you want to just tell the listeners a bit about where we're coming from, what we do, why they're listening to this podcast, why it has any value to them? If it does at all. Well, I know this might be a short.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you want to set me up for why are you listening to the podcast.
I needed a drink of water, so I thought you can handle this part.
Yeah, we offer a prepared and also off the cuff take on what's going on with the Argos, and I think that we have a lot of high school coaching football in our background, and both have a deep interest in the X's and O's of the game, and I think we offer a take on the Argos that isn't out there anywhere. It's a bit of a vacuum in the CFL in Toronto, so we kind of jump in there, and we're pretty positive most of the time, but we call them out when they're doing something that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think my favorite thing about doing this podcast with you is that you offer a defensive perspective. You know, between the two of us, we've got something like 40 years of coaching experience, and you're always on the defensive side of the ball. I'm always on the offensive side of the ball. And I think, do we coach 8 years together, 6 to 8 years together, somewhere in that range? Yeah, in that range. And so, the things that I love about the game are the things that you hate about the game, and vice versa. And so, you've got the D perspective and I've got the O perspective. So I think that makes us perfect for this pairing.
And people may say, you coached high school. What the heck does that have to do with professional football? But I'll tell you, you go to practice and everybody's bigger and everybody's faster. But other than that, it feels like every practice I've ever been to.
I was saying that same thing to Pinball Clemens when we were in Edmonton a few weeks ago. Just that when I watch the practices at Lamport Stadium, and we sit there and we laugh, like you and I have laughed about some of the same stuff that you see, the same things that either frustrate coaches or make coaches laugh or make coaches widen their eyes and be impressed by something. It's the same stuff. Football is football, and whether it's pee-wee football or high school or semi-pro or U Sports, NCAA, pro football is football. So it's all the same. All right, JB, let's get into McLeod Bethel Thompson a little bit here, because he's been lighting it up as a New Orleans Breaker. Is this like, does it hurt at all to watch McLeod Bethel Thompson playing for another team? Is this like watching your ex with another guy?
No, I mean it's more like watching my neighbor with a different guy. I'm happy for him. I think that we were big proponents of him last year. We both felt that he was an elite CFL quarterback, and that was proven out when they won the Grey Cup. And he's gone home for family reasons and is doing really well in the USFL, and hopefully it gets a shot at maybe getting a camp invite to the NFL if he can continue to really perform this well in the USFL. Right now, he is probably the best quarterback in the USFL. They're 2-0, and he's thrown for 600 yards, and he's doing everything we knew he was capable of. He's still an incredibly hot and cold quarterback. When he's on, he's dynamite, and when he's off, he's really off. But I'm actually really excited for it. I love seeing him do well, and I really hope it builds to a camp shot for him, because we talked about, like, a lot of NFL teams. I know he's older and he's not a prospect anymore, but NFL teams are not looking for a prospect to run their practice squad. They're looking for a guy who can run it without much coaching, and I think he fits that bill perfectly. If you have if you want a guy to run your scout team, so I'm really pulling for him to continue to do well.
And I think he's a guy too that if he can, and understand, like, we think this is a long shot. This isn't, even if, and I think he's on track right now to be the USFL MVP. He's playing so well. But even if he wins the championship, it's still a long shot to get a camp invite. But as we've seen, McLeod's one of those guys, like, once you get him in the door, remember his time with Toronto, he wasn't supposed to be the guy almost every single season, right? It was supposed to be Ricky Ray, and Ray gets hurt. There's McLeod. It's supposed to be James Franklin. Franklin gets hurt. McLeod's in and, throws for the most touchdowns in the league. Then it's supposed to be Arbuckle, and then McLeod comes in and is so good that Arbuckle gets traded away. And last year was the only year where it was supposed to be McLeod, and it was McLeod. And so there's always a way. Anytime he's given a chance, he makes the most of it. And, that's all he needs. But like you said before, I'm so happy he's able to play in front of Chinaka and Aziza. Like, just seeing him after the game, hugging his family, and knowing that that's why he's doing it is pretty cool. But like you said, there are those McLeod moments, right? Like, he started the first half of his first game. It was not good. It was terrible. I thought he might get benched at halftime, and I was like, man, this might be it. And I think it was because there was a little bit of surprise. Like, his O-line was not having a good game in that first outing. He got hit a ton. He had no time, and he adjusted in the second half. He got rid of the ball a lot quicker, and since then he hasn't looked back. Hasn't thrown an interception, 3 touchdowns. He's led his team to victories late in the fourth quarter in both games. He had just some beautiful downfield throws, and that was something that you and I had criticized him for last year. Like, one of the only things he couldn't do over the last 2 seasons was hit that deep ball consistently, and he's been able to find that with the Breakers. So, that's great to see. So, we're cheering for him. If you get a chance, if you have the means to be able to watch a New Orleans Breakers game, it's just cool to see McLeod out there. And he's got a ton of CFL guys around him too, or former CFL guys around him as well. You got Wes Hills in the backfield, and there are guys sort of scattered all over the league. Names that you'll recognize, guys that were in camp for a little bit and just couldn't quite give it a go. Like Kenji Bahar last week was the quarterback for Houston. He was briefly in Argos camp. Was it last year? It was 2 years ago. He was in there with Nick Tiano and with Pipkin, Arbuckle, McLeod, and there he is suddenly on the opposite side of the field as McLeod in the USFL. So yeah, a lot of familiar names. So if you get a chance to check it out and you're an MBT fan, definitely worth it. JB, let's get into the CFL Draft, because this is the draft special. A week away, as we said, less than a week away by the time you're listening to this. So we've had a few questions over the last couple of weeks specifically about how the CFL draft works. And I know most of you, longtime listeners, have a really good understanding of the draft. I just want to spend a minute bringing people up to speed who are new, because it's never our, anytime we do anything on the show, our intention is never to overwhelm or to make you feel bad about what you don't know about football or anything like that. In fact, it's the opposite. We want to share the game. We want to teach things about the game, give you things to look for, and make you feel included in this. And so, if this is not new for you, please be patient for just a minute as we bring people up to speed on this, because we did have a lot of CFL Draft 101 style questions. So basically, it is like most other leagues' drafts, except there are some differences, but it's the same idea of, you've got a draft order, last place picks first place picks last, and you go, round by round through the draft. There are 8 rounds this year. That has changed a few times, but 8 rounds in this draft. What's different is that this is just a draft of Canadian players. Now, there's an asterisk there too, because what it means to be a Canadian player has changed a little bit back and forth, but forget that part for now. Just think of it as Canadian players. We call these nationals, and a large percentage, in fact, most of your team needs to be made up of nationals. And on any given game day, you've got to start. You've got to dress 21 nationals, and so on your roster, on your 45-man roster, that's obviously a large percentage. You've got a couple global players in there. You've got Americans in there, and so you're drafting specifically Canadians. Now, they're not all from U Sports schools. In fact, a lot of the guys picked in the first round often are from NCAA programs. We got so many Canadians that are now playing for NCAA teams. And what separates this, though, from other drafts is that the best Canadians aren't drafted in the first round typically, because it's too much of a risk. And this is where the CFL draft is so much more difficult than the NFL draft, because in the NFL draft, you're just drafting the best players. Everybody's available to you. In the CFL draft, not only is it Canadians, but you don't want to draft a Canadian that's going to go on to have a great NFL career, because that's of no use to you. The money's not the same. The opportunities aren't the same. They're almost certainly going to take that NFL route if it's open to them. And so, for example, this year, there's a bunch of great Canadians who are going to be drafted in the NFL. Chase Brown, Sidney Brown, just to name a couple right off the bat. And then those guys, I don't even put them on my draft board, because I know they're going to be drafted in the NFL. They're going to play there for several years. Someone will. I would not spend a pick if I were the Argos on guys like that. Now, I would spend a pick on some other guys like City So, for example, who he's a guard and he's going to be drafted probably late in the draft. But that is worth a pick. Not a first rounder, but that's a guy that you might take a little later on, because even though he's going to be drafted, maybe it's 6th round, maybe it's 7th round, maybe he spends a couple of years in the NFL, but there's a much better chance a guy like him ends up back up here in the CFL. And so there are a few guys like that where, yeah, they're probably going to spend a year or two down in the NFL, maybe more. Maybe it works out well for them and great. But if not, then you know that your team has their rights when they come up here. And so that's the balance here. And I know, JB, like you love the lottery pick idea, and the Argos have done a lot of that in the last few years. Luigi Villain, for example. And, there's probably 3 or 4 guys, like St. Just was in there too, guys that we're waiting on. Maybe they'll end up coming up here, maybe not. But why do you think a late round pick is worth taking a guy like that, even though you may never see him in the CFL?
Well, I mean, statistically, everybody after the second round has almost no chance of playing in the CFL. So when you're looking at that, you're better to take a shot, and maybe a guy washes out in the NFL, or he's just doesn't quite have the measurables to play in the NFL and still has elite athleticism and wants to play ball. So to me, it makes total sense to take a shot at that, because you're not really wasting picks. Like if you went over the last 10 years and looked at who played in the CFL from the 6th and 7th round, you're not going to find very many players. So to me, it's risk free. You might as well take your shot at a reasonable risk. Like you're not going to get if somebody's drafted, they're probably going to kick around for 3 or 4 years in the NFL, practice squads, what have you. You're really looking for guys who are more like on the cusp of being drafted, high priority free agents. Maybe they wash out in camp and are able to come up here simply because the NFL demands a measurable that they don't have in terms of size and speed. But to me, it doesn't make any sense at all to use those picks on anything other than that in the final 2 rounds.
And the Argos are one of the few teams that have really found sort of diamonds in the rough, guys in those later rounds that have actually played and are still on the roster, but it is rare. The Argos, I think, there was a stat I saw on Twitter. I think it was Marshall Ferguson that put it out. It was a little while ago now, but the Argos were by far the best at retention over the last 6 years. Guys that were drafted and were still playing on the team. It was extremely high, but it was still under 50%. But nobody else was.
That's including
was
the first 3 rounds.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And so, yeah, it's tough. It's a really tough draft, and that's why we respect the brass of the Argos over the last few years. They've had great drafts. When you think about the production they've got, not just in those early rounds, but all the way through the draft. So. Yeah, and some long plays that may start coming up, like Sage Dockstader, for example. He's a guy they drafted. They weren't sure. He was playing at New Mexico State. They weren't sure if he was going to get an NFL look. He didn't get drafted, but he was UDFA. He ended up in New Orleans. Got cut last year. He's playing in the XFL now, and we don't know. Maybe he does end up coming back to the CFL. Maybe it's this year. Maybe it's next year. But it's looking more and more like that may be a guy we see, and he's an excellent player. And that's a guy that they just felt was worth the gamble. And yeah, there are a number of those guys this year in the sort of first 2 rounds. I've got a couple guys projected that I think are going to be here sooner rather than later, if not immediately. And then a few guys in the later rounds, the 3rd, 4th round, where yeah, they're going to end up in the NFL, but it's worth a gamble. JB, why is the CFL draft so important? All the stars of the league, I shouldn't say all because that's just not accurate, but most of the stars in the league are Americans. You've got guys like Curly Gittens Jr., certainly Kean Schaefer-Baker. There are Canadian stars, Andrew Harris, Canadian star. But most of the guys you see week to week are Americans. The quarterbacks, now that Nathan Rourke's gone, are all Americans. So why is the CFL draft so important?
Well, I mean, it doesn't seem that important for most of the league based on the playing stats. I think the Argos.
But again, to interrupt you though, like the Argos came off a Grey Cup win. To the 2 best teams at drafting, Toronto and Winnipeg. It may not be the Canadians that are on the highlight reels every single week, but last year's Grey Cup game, Enoch Mwamba, Canadian, Curly Gittens Jr., Canadian, Robbie Smith, Canadian, like guys that are standout players. Now, Gittens Jr. didn't actually have a good Grey Cup at all, but Robbie Smith was the hero at the end. He had a really solid game throughout, and Mwamba won like every award you could, and those are Canadian players. So they do jump up, and Andrew Harris, of course, too.
Yeah, like I'll finish there. Yes, I think most of the league doesn't seem to think it's very important based on the playing, but the Argos clearly do, and it has shown to be a successful strategy that you can, you have to have 7 starters. You have to have 21 dressed who are nationals, Canadian, or sort of qualify as Canadian through a variety of rules. And the higher the quality you have at special teams, the higher the quality you have at offensive line. It makes a huge difference if you don't have a drop off in talent when you're trying to get a Canadian into your roster. So it really is about overall team depth, and clearly the Argos have chosen that, which I think is the smart thing to do, which is to really make sure that they have a quality special teams and a really deep offensive line. And that's, to me, what the draft is for. Occasionally, maybe you get a star at wide receiver in the first couple of picks. But for the most part, I'm about stacking special teams and deepening the offensive line, and the Argos have done a really good job with that because, I think that's really why they're in a great position. So from an Argo perspective, the draft is really important, and they have been really successful, and I think it's why they've been able to be one of the top teams the last 2 years.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I would say that the Argos are the only team in the CFL that could legitimately go into the season without anyone from the draft. They have all their Canadians in place right now.
Well, which is why I think, one of the many reasons they traded their first round pick, beyond it being an unbelievable opportunity to bring in talent. But I don't think that this is not a team that needs a first round pick to hit, or anybody to hit. I think anything they score in this draft is absolute luxury.
And let's move on to talk a little bit about draft strategy, because this sort of ties into both things that we're talking about here. The draft strategy for the Argos isn't really, in my mind, and again, I don't know exactly the Argos. As much as I spend time planning for the draft every year, the Argos always go out and do something that I didn't see coming, that I wasn't expecting, and so everything I'm about to say to you could completely fall on its face come Tuesday night next week. But the way I think this draft is going to go is they're not really going to be even looking for guys who are going to contribute this year, which isn't terribly unusual for the CFL draft. It's not common to have a lot of first-year starting Canadians on CFL teams, but the Argos have over the last few years. You had Gregor McKellar, who was starting at left guard as a rookie. You had Peter Nicastro, who was starting at center the year before that. They have hit on a number of these guys, but I don't think that's going to be the plan this year. I think instead, you look at the way the roster is going to turn over after this season because of that 2020, 2021 sort of 2-year combo because of the canceled season in 2020. You've got 2 draft classes whose rookie contracts are coming to an end. And so really the guys you take in this year's draft aren't necessarily going to be stars that are going to shine for you this year, but guys that can fill in next year. And so I was looking through the Argos roster, and like we said, there aren't any holes this year. They're perfectly ready to go. They could start 8 or 9 Canadians this year and be perfectly fine and be a really strong team. And they might. They did that sometimes last year. But the problem is with so many people not necessarily leaving, but potentially leaving after the season, you got to start filling in there. And so that's where I do think they have to be a little bit tactical, because you've got a couple of receivers that are coming off the board. You don't know what's going to happen with Brissett. You don't know what's going to happen with Neild. And so, they probably are at some point going to have to take a receiver. But you look at this draft class, that's tough too, because you've got guys that I've projected as being potential starting receivers down the road. They're just not that many that I see. Now, if you want a special teams type receiver, we do have some of those guys. There are guys that technically play receiver but aren't necessarily going to be on the field as a receiver. They're going to be special teams contributors. A bunch of those guys that I've got projected as 6th, 7th, 8th round picks, but maybe teams see those as more valuable this year because they know they need those guys on their roster, and so maybe those guys go a lot earlier than we think. So that's going to be interesting to watch too. But yeah, this strategy this year, I think, is going to be based on guys that are leaving. These guys will come in and have a year to figure it out, and then they're off and running next season. So JB, let's before we get into guys that we think the Argos should target, I just want to tell you a little bit about Etobicoke Toronto Rise Flag Football. They're one of our sponsors this season as well. And this segment is brought to you by Etobicoke Toronto Rise Flag Football. They're powered by Under Armour. And registration for flag football for their spring flag football season for all players from kindergarten through grade 12 is happening right now. The season starts May 6th, which is coming up soon, and runs through June 24th. And all teams that are in this program can qualify for the provincial championships coming up in Georgetown in July, which is pretty cool. Plus, they have an all-new girls flag football program. It's an all-girls program. And if you want to find out more information about that, you can go to uaflag.ca/Etobicoke. That's UA as in Under Armour, uaflag.ca/Etobicoke, or you can find them on Instagram or Facebook. And as with all of our sponsors, we're really happy to have them on board this season. All right, JB, we talked about the fact that because of the Jordan Williams trade, we don't have the Argos with a first-round pick this year. So let's talk about guys that we are targeting for round 2, because someone's going to fall. Someone's going to be there. Someone falls every year into round 2, and everybody's like, "How? I can't believe they fell." We had Deontay Knight last year, Adeboboye as well. They both fell, and the Argos were able to grab both of them. Someone's going to fall. Who's the guy you are looking for in round 2 for the Argos of this year's draft?
It's interesting looking at how the people have sort of changed their minds. It's not, from everything I can see, not a particularly strong draft. So I think that it is probably a draft that is prone to be surprising, to be hard to mock. I think there's going to be more variety in the picks than normally we see. I don't think you have necessarily an automatic like top 10. I would love to see if we could get the London guard, Gravik Philip, to fall. I know people are falling in love with him, and he is a road grader. He's certainly not flawless. He when he's out, when you look at his film, he is the classic O-line bully, taking cheap shots on receivers when he gets a chance, finishing his blocks, looking for a pancake every time, run plays if they are crashing down. He is taking advantage of that opportunity every time to wipe out the guy in front of him. He's a little, you can see it like a lot of road graders. He's better at run than pass, and can he hold up against pass rush? I think it's that'll be something he'll have to work on. I think it's a little easier at guard than tackle. He certainly is not ever going to be a tackle, but I really like him. I think if you're looking for a guy to add to your room who already does one thing really, really well in terms of being a running road grader, and if you can work on the footwork and and coach him up in terms of being able to take on more pass rush defenders, I'd love to see him fall to the second. I don't think he will, because I think people are going to fall in love with his pancake film, and offensive line coaches are going to be banging the table looking for that snowplow in their room. But he is the one I'm holding out for. That maybe his weaknesses scare a few people off.
It's possible. And just before I give you my thought on that, I do want to say, as an offensive coach, and this is where we differ a little bit, what you call cheap shots on DBs, I think is finishing your block, doing what you're supposed to do when you pull out on a screenplay. Only a defensive coach would say that the offensive line blocking a DB is a cheap shot. But yeah, no, he's nasty. He gets in there, and the Argos do like guys like that. You watch Nicastro's film from his time as a Calgary Dino, or a McKellar for that matter too. Both of those guys are not guys you want to line up against, and they love that kind of lineman. Darius Bladek's got a little bit of that. Philip Blake had a little bit of that. He's obviously not with the Argos this year, but they're drawn to, like, guys that you don't want to line up against. Love having those guys on my team, and I know Vince Magri and company feel the same way about that, just based on looking at who they draft each year. Yeah, they like guys that you don't want to line up against.
Yeah, there's not a ton of offensive line depth in the draft, which makes it unlikely he drops to 2, but He he certainly is not the most polished offensive lineman. So I don't think it's a slam dunk. He goes in one.
Yeah, like going into the combine, he was viewed as being one of the top guys, if not the top offensive lineman at the combine. And it was a little bit hit and miss with him. He had a bit of a rough start, and he got burned a couple of times in individual drills. And I think it depends which part of the combine people are going to remember most on draft day. Because if you look at those early reps, I know a lot of people look at each other saying, like, his film looks so good. That whole Western O line was so dominant. And you see his film, like you're talking about, he's pretty solid. But yeah, he didn't start out that way at the combine, but then the next day he pulled it all together and he looked the way that he did on film. And so, yeah, I don't know. I think it's totally possible that he drops.
He also had 26 reps on the bar.
Yeah, he's a machine. Yeah,
so I know. But I mean, if you can't dream, what's the point of doing a mock draft if you're not going to dream?
But there are scenarios where that will happen. And so, like, and if you'd like to take a look, I've got my rankings, players 1 all the way through 85 on xsandargos.com if you want to take a look at that. And please check back later in the week after the NFL draft is done. I'm going to review my rankings and I'll make a printable sheet so you can print it out, follow along with the draft. I'll make it, I was going to say interactive. It's not really interactive. It's like interactive for an old man like me who, leaves a box for you to fill in who drafts them and where on a piece of paper. But that's how I roll. So printable draft sheet, that's right up my alley. So if you're wired like me, that'll work for you. But that's going to come up later in the week. You can find that all on xsandargos.com. So for my Argos first pick, second round, I'm also going to take a flyer on a guy that may not be there. But like we said last year, you never know. The CFL draft is so weird. And every year, someone's going to draft a guy that I have as a 4th, 5th, 6th rounder, and they're going to take him in the first round, and we're all going to be stunned. And it will leave someone there for the Argos in round 2. I'm going to go with Leg Corte Moore. And this is a dream, just like your Grovic dream. These guys probably aren't there. Man, Leg Corte Moore is fun to watch. The reason he may drop is he's a little bit of a tweener. He, between being, and he's a defensive lineman, so between being a defensive tackle and a defensive end, where's he going to go? So I think the way that teams are looking at him, they're really viewing him as a defensive tackle. That's sort of what he has to be. And he's going to probably need to put on a little bit of weight for that. I don't know if teams are going to play, if he's going to be heavy enough for that, or they're going to have to, maybe play him sort of rotationally as an outside piece. I don't know. For me personally, I don't care. He's the kind of player you got to find a way to get him in there. He's a great leader, and that's something that really stood out at the combine. A guy that was encouraging everyone else at the draft or at the combine, encouraging other players, encouraging the global players. You see him after reps, he would go off to the side. And this was one of my favorite things to watch was after he'd be done with reps. Nobody's watching. There aren't cameras around. There aren't reporters over there with microphones. And you see him talking to guys about things they've got going on, moves they had, strategies they employed. And a guy like that, to me, that's someone that loves football. And so you bring a bunch of guys into your team that love playing football. That's a recipe for success. And then the other thing I like, they had a session of long snapping. And I do think the Argos need a long snapper. Now, there's a couple of guys I think they should look at drafting later on in the draft. And again, you can find that in my article on xsandargos.com. But, Leg Corte Moore, he's not a starting long snapper in the CFL, but JB, you remember last year when the Argos lost Jake Reinhardt and they had to fill in, they got a bunch of guys trying to long snap that just weren't quite there because they're not long snappers. Leg Corte Moore is like just off being a CFL caliber long snapper. He was at the combine at Edmonton, he was the best long snapper there because it wasn't where all the specialists were doing their long snapping. That was held at a different combine. But of all the guys there, man, he stood out. He can really fire that ball back there. And so that's just an added bonus. If you get a guy that can also long snap at a near CFL level, you never know when you're going to need a backup, and he can step in and do that. So a little bit of value added for Leg Corte Moore. JB, who's your mid-round guy? So we get to the third, fourth, fifth, somewhere in there. Who's the guy that you're thinking maybe he can fall to the third, maybe he can fall to the fourth, and a guy you're excited about?
Um, I'm really excited about. I mean, it depends. I know you have him ranked a little higher, but I'm really excited about Lucas Cormier from Mount A.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
I think when you watch his film, to me, what it screams is special teams ace. Could he challenge Haggerty at some point for that spot as the Canadian safety? I mean, he clearly has good hands. He clearly has, he feels comfortable in space, and he's able. His picks are all positional. They look really easy, but that's just because he's read the play really well and he's put himself right in the quarterback's path without the quarterback realizing it. But his pursuit speed, his tackle violence. His measurables are pretty good. He's 6'1", and he put up 10 bench, which is not tons, but pretty good for a DB. Most of the DBs were a little bit below that. So you don't expect a DB to put up what an offensive lineman would. And, his 40 time, 4.62, is very good. He doesn't look that fast on film, but his tackle pursuit is really good, which is what really kind of triggered me to look at him as a special teams guy that you could roll in. I think he is a very good football player. I think that he'd be a steal if we could get him in the fourth round. I would be over the moon because I think he absolutely makes the squad.
Yeah, I don't know if he slips to fourth. I can see him slipping to third. Like you said, I have him ranked really high, but I do think I'm in the minority on that. I wrote an article about guys I was interested in on Three Down Nation, and if you want to check that out, you can just search up my articles on Three Down Nation and find that. And I wrote a little bit about Cormier and things I liked about him, and it's a lot of the stuff that you're talking about too, that you saw on film as well. What I liked about, actually, before I get to that, you mentioned battling it out for a job in Toronto. That's a real need. I know they've got Mechie signed through 24, but like with CFL contracts, it never really is to the full length of the deal if the team finds another way out. These contracts are often very team friendly. And so after this year, Josh Haggerty's contract is up. Mechie, you never know if they're going to decide to move on or if they're going to stick with him. But I think they will need, between this year and next, like, you got to have other options. I know they got Eric Sutton too. I don't really love him as a safety. I like him pretty much everywhere else. But yeah, Cormier, to me, just absolutely jumped out. And a few reasons for that. Number one, at the combine, his equipment didn't arrive. And so he had to borrow equipment. He was wearing shoes that weren't his own shoes. He was wearing an Elks helmet because he just had to take what they had available, it being in Edmonton. And so that, I think, actually helped draw attention to him, to me, because I kept looking up and like, who the heck is that guy? I'm like, oh yeah, right, that's Cormier. And man, did he look good. So I agree with you. I think I've got him actually graded as first round talent. And I don't think everyone else does. And now maybe other guys, maybe scouts see it the way I do. I'd be flattered if they do, but I know I've seen him mocked late. I've seen him with third, fourth, fifth, even round value. But yeah, if you can find this guy in the third round, like if he's still there in the third round and the Argos have not taken him by then, like, they absolutely have to jump on that. I would even take him in the second round if he was there and some of the guys we talked about weren't. Then yeah, Cormier is absolutely worth it. I see him as a starting safety in this league in 2024.
We'll see. I'd be surprised if he went to when you watch the film, he certainly is not the twitchiest athlete ever.
No.
At safety, where you're like, okay, I'm not totally sure how that translates, but he definitely does have closing speed. He definitely has a physicality, and he clearly understands route combinations and being in the right place. So he's got ball hawk hands. You don't just end up picking by accident. So yeah, I'm very curious to see how he drops. I think we got a shot at him at 4. We'll see. We'll see who's right.
Yeah, again, I don't want to. I don't want to wait that long. I'd be too nervous about even chancing that. But man, that guy's talented. And I like you said, like maybe the fast twitch isn't quite there, but I think you can get away with that a little bit at safety, and that is where Canadians tend to play on the defense in the CFL because you don't necessarily need to be a 4-4 guy. Like it's not like Mechie didn't put up a faster 40 time, so you can be that guy as long as you've got the processing speed. And that's something Cormier did. And he showed that off at the combine as well, instantly processing, saying, as the play's developing, it's like, this is Mills, and he knows to cut in, he knows where to go, and makes plays on the ball.
Good height too.
Yeah, no, everything about him, I like. I think I'm in the minority, and obviously you are too on this, but maybe not. Maybe he's gone in the first round, and there goes that dream. But yeah, I would love if the Argos could get him in the mid rounds. So my mid-round guy, I'm going to go with Charlie Ringland. Charlie Ringland was the, I don't know, it was such an emotional roller coaster watching Charlie at the combine because he wasn't a guy that I had pegged as a player of interest going into the combine. He hadn't really stood out to me too much on film. I watched him a little bit and I'm like, oh, okay, but nothing. I wasn't going in there thinking, man, I can't wait to see Charlie Ringland. And then he went and jumped out of the gym on his testing. I think he had a 40-inch vertical. And not only that, on the field, it showed up too, that explosiveness. And I don't know why I didn't see that earlier in the film, but it is there. It just didn't jump out to me when I was watching initially. I'll go back and watch some of his tape and I'm like, oh yeah, I get that. I see that. I know what I'm looking for now. But then unfortunately, he was injured. He took a non-contact injury, an ACL injury, and I know he's getting that repaired, and it, in all likelihood, is going to be out all of this season, but should be 100% healthy by next year. This fits perfectly into the Argos' plans. Like we talked about, they're not drafting these guys, especially in the mid-rounds. You're not drafting the guys for this year. You're drafting them for the future. And so if that means that Charlie spends the year rehabbing, studying the playbook, doing film, familiarizing himself with the defense, the coaching staff, the players, perfect. Love that. Because this guy is a first or second round talent, and he's going to drop. Because unlike the Argos, a lot of other teams need these guys to contribute this year. They desperately need Canadians on the field somewhere, even if it's just playing specials this year. And so they can't maybe draft a guy like Charlie Ringland. The Argos can. And the Argos love value in their late picks. We've seen them do that before. So absolutely draft him starting, I don't know where you start that. You start probably third, fourth, fifth round thinking about that because I think he'll be there. And so, yeah, absolutely a guy I would take. And I know you love that, being a New England Patriots fan. You love those sort of value finds, guys that sort of,
I mean, to be honest, they tend not to turn out, but I still salute the idea behind it.
He's there.
And I agree. I think the Argos are in a place where they are not accumulating talent, that they're as the defending champs, they're a team that has the luxury of picking somebody they don't need right away. And I fully agree with you. They should take advantage of that. That's one of the perks of having a deep roster is, you can do that. You look at Edmonton or Ottawa, really most of the league, they need to pick somebody who could potentially pop for them at camp, and that would be a great pick if the Argos put him on ice for a year.
Yeah, love it. All right, late rounds, JB. We get to the 7th to the 8th. Who are you taking a swing for late in this draft?
I don't know if he would go that late. I do like the kid from St. Mary's. That's my own kind of bias, Sebastian Howard, who is kind of positionless. He's not going to play tight end in the CFL. Obviously, he has a fantastic story in terms of overcoming, being homeless and having, really not an easy path. And even at St. Mary's, not that easy. But he clearly has terrific athleticism. that would be kind of fun if we added him to the mix at the end. I'd like a good story. For me, I'm going to go off the board. I really hope he gets picked. So there's a kid out of Queens, Eric Colonna, who played in Peel and just is everything you want in a football player. He's only 5'9", and he had 14. He put it up 14 times, and his 40 is 4.97. His measurables are not going to jump out at you, but my God, I will just tell you, he's a coach's dream. I mean, there isn't a coach. If we brought the Queens coach on now, I bet he'd talk for an hour about Eric Colonna. He is everything you want in a football player. I know if they were to pick him, he would absolutely make the team as a special teamer. You cannot go wrong by picking people like him and having them on your bus. In my opinion, I would love for them to pick him. It's my own personal bias having coached against him and watched him for his 5 years in Peel. He is a great football player, and then he took it to Queens and performed well at the next level, at the CIS level. And he's not going to blow you away when you look at him coming off the bus, but not to get too cliche-ish, but he is a football player. Absolutely a guy you want on your team. I would love to see him get a chance.
Yeah, I'd love that too. We actually coached against like 10 of the guys in this year's draft, which has been the case for each of like the last 5 years. But yeah, he's one of those guys that you definitely remember. I know he gave you a number of headaches, as he did me. So
he just does everything so well. You can just see it. Everything he does well. He is athletic. He does hit like a truck. He's in the right position all the time. I just can't believe that there's not a spot for him on a special teams.
And the reason he might drop is because he's 5'9", and so that's where he might fall. But he's a gym rat. He's tough as nails. Man, I love watching him play. And he's kind of like, you should watch his highlight tape on YouTube. He hits guys so hard
because not only because of his physicality, but also because he's always in the right spot, so he can always take the exact correct angle. Like, being able to hit guys that hard is more than just speed and closing speed. It's about being where you're supposed to be, and that's just the definition of him. It's going to be tough. I know his measurables do not grab anybody. That is I think it's going to be a long shot, but I'm pulling for it.
Yeah, and check the tape. Like, I know like the measurables maybe not, but check the tape and like his 14 reps on the bench, that's for a DB. Like we're talking about
very good.
Yeah, that's good stuff.
Right. I mean, that's 225.
Yeah.
It's a lot.
I know.
I don't know if anybody out there has tried to lift 225 pounds.
Yeah, but, as a 5'9" DB doing it, he's a tank.
225 pounds is a lot of weight. I don't think you can stress that enough. For those of you who go to the gym or don't go to the gym, like lying on the ground and lifting your couch or lifting your fridge,
with your couch on top of it.
Yeah, it's a lot of weight for him to put that up 14 times. I mean, what it shows you is is that he's a gym rat. He's dedicated. He's training. I always love bench as such a key indicator because you can't cheat bench. You either you put the time in the gym or you didn't, and the bench shows that. And like I say, I guarantee you, he won every coach's award there was at Queens.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I bet you the offense, Queens' own offense, probably hated him from practice. And I love guys like that to have on my team.
I hope. I just, people thought he wasn't going to translate to CIS,
I know. I remember those conversations.
Because he's not that big and he's not that fast. And then he went out and, he was absolutely a good CIS player. I think he can do it.
How many more years before you start calling it U Sports?
Never. Never.
One last thing on Eric Colonna is we talked about value added.
U Sports. I'm not going to call it U Sports. Worst name ever.
So we talked about value added earlier, and Colonna's got punt return experience. He played running back in high school as well. Just sees the field really well, like you said, football player, and you can send him back there to return punts, etc.
Wildcat quarterback.
Wildcat QB,
and punt
right?
returning, a little bit of punt returning.
Yep,
a little value added stuff there.
Yep, it's all good. So I like that pick. I'll go a different direction. So I'm gonna go receiver late, and there's a few guys I'm looking at. So you've got a couple guys that I don't see. I talked about this earlier. Guys that I don't see as maybe getting time as a receiver per se, but it's their position, and they can be elite special teamers. These two guys probably aren't there. Richard Burton, Jonathan Rosary, those guys, they have the potential to be special team studs. I have them ranked much later in the draft than I think probably a lot of people do, because for the Argos, I'm not looking for them simply. I don't want a player that's just a special teams contributor for the Argos, because I think they're in a sort of a different place. I want a guy that's going to be a starting positional player next year. And so those guys don't quite fit it. But if they are there in the 7th round, 8th round, Rosary is a tank. Burton's got that sort of aggressiveness, that fire in his eyes. Those guys would be interesting. But the guy I'm going to go with is Giovanni Cunningham. And this one is a sentimental one for me because I'm going to have trouble backing it up. I can't back it up with stats. I can't back it up with film. But I'm going to back it up with heart. So this is Jimmy the Jet Cunningham's son. And longtime Argo fans remember the Jet for the devastation that he caused in the return game. He was electric. So much fun to watch. And Giovanni Cunningham was used at Cornell pretty much that way. He doesn't really have much in the way of receiving stats. And even his return stats didn't jump off the page. They were good. They were good. There's nothing wrong with them. And he was consistently a returner throughout his career at Cornell. But, he didn't end up with even a single touchdown in the NCAA. And so usually you'd be looking for something like that, some sort of production, or more than the 4.66 that he posted. And for a guy that's 5'8", 178, 4.66 doesn't really stand out. But I'm telling you, there's magic with the Cunningham name. There's history there. And you get him in double blue, put that Argos helmet on him. We're talking 7th round, 8th round. If the son of the Jet is still hanging around there, there's no way that Michael Pinball Clemens does not pull the trigger on that one and say, we got to get Mini Jet in there.
Absolutely, I'm a believer in genetics. It's proven out time and time again that if guys whose dads were in the CFL are really good.
It usually works out that way. Like, sons of coaches, sons of former players.
But it's not just. I think that's a good metric. Even the Mike O'Shea's kid.
Yeah, that's interesting too. I don't know what to do with him either. He's another guy. I was looking at him on my board. I'm like, where do I put him with Okanagan? Right? He was playing with Okanagan, and you look at some of that film there, and it's like, what do I do with this? But he was great.
Keep him as ransom. We're gonna play. We're gonna go up against Winnipeg. Maybe he's a little divided with his son on the Argos. I'm all for it. I'm all for having Mike O'Shea's kid on our roster.
All right. Well, this sounds like a plan. So CFL Draft, it is next Tuesday, May 2nd, 8 o'clock. First couple rounds are on TSN. You can watch the stream of it on the CFL website following that. We'll, of course, be live tweeting, reacting to it. And JB, we're going to record our podcast, I guess, right as the draft finishes like we did last year. So it'll be ready for your listening enjoyment.
We'll see. I always hate that podcast because we sound like such fanboys about all the Argo picks, but I'll be damned if they don't crush it every year. So maybe this will be the year we'll finally get to take the Argos to task for a bad draft.
It's true. We've loved 3 straight drafts. So
I know. I'm hoping for a poor one. I'm hoping I can really have some. I'm hoping I can question some picks.
Just so you can say some different things. That's great.
Yeah, I hate that kind of just. Yeah, I want
like
some question marks.
Team.
Do you think anybody takes the York Rocket?
No, I don't know. Maybe someone does.
So
like, is it 4.41 speed? Like that's super
Somebody's
fast.
There's no chance a 4.41 kid doesn't get picked by somebody.
I want every reason. There's every reason for us to cheer for him. Like that's another guy we both coached against. And a guy that we want to cheer for. He's a York guy, so I love him as well for that. But I just don't see it there. And so someone will, but no, I don't think that's going to be the Argos. But we'll see. It's exciting.
Yeah,
JB,
I think it is an exciting draft.
I'm trying to close the pod here. JB, do you have any final thoughts? Sorry, I should have asked that first.
No. I feel I've said all I need to.
All right, well, that will just about do it for us on this episode of the X's and Argos podcast. We're so happy to be back. We're happy to have you back. And for those new listeners and viewers, we're happy to have you on board. For JB, this is Ben Grant saying so long, and may all your pre-snap reads be good ones. I'll see ya.